Hi everyone! Today we're going to take a look at the best CPU under $300 in the market for this year. First, we're going to show you our top 10 best picks, and we'll talk about what you should look for before buying a CPU under $300. You can find links to all of the products we've mentioned in this video down in the description below. Let's get started. At the first position of our list, we have Intel Core i5 12600. Intel's 12th generation of CPUs includes several of the best processors for sale in 2022. You'll typically find the extremely powerful NNE 12900 at the top of the best of 2022 list, but the i5 12600 is usually right behind it, at half the price of the NNE and under $300. The i5 12600 is a shoo-in for the best budget CPU of 2022. Many of the Alder Lake 12th Gen Intel CPUs use a hybrid architecture, and this includes the 10 cores available in the i5 12600. The hybrid architecture is a mix of two kinds of cores. The first is the more traditional, high-clock CPU cores, Golden Cove, which Intel calls the performance cores or P cores. These are powerful hyper-threaded cores, and the i5 12600 has 6 of them with a base clock rate of 3.7 GHz and a max clock rate of 4.9 GHz. They'll do most of the heavy lifting for gaming, rendering, and other CPU-intensive processes. In addition, the remaining 4 cores are efficiency cores, referred to as E-cores. They're a more compact, power-efficient core with only a single thread and a base clock of 2.8 GHz and a boosted clock of 3.6 GHz. They'll quickly handle light processing tasks in the background, leaving the central P cores free to focus on heavier tasks. The combination of P cores and E cores makes this processor a huge jump up from processors of the previous generation, including the significantly more expensive 8-core NNE 11900 and the fan-favorite 6-core Ryzen 5 5600s. Current-gen processors with 8-10 hyper-threaded cores will still perform at a higher level but will consistently be almost twice the price. Furthermore, the i5 12600 is an unlocked processor, which means that it's ready for overclocking. With proper cooling, you'll be able to overclock to around 5.3 GHz and even more if you put the time and effort in. Now, since this is a K-series CPU, it does not ship with a cooler. This could set you back anywhere from $20-$30 for the equivalent of what you'd find bundled with other CPUs, to $100-$200 for some premium options. If you're not planning on overclocking it, the cheaper option should be fine, but you'll notice quieter and smoother performance with a mid-range cooler. A quick word on compatibility. Obviously, you can't just put any CPU on any motherboard. Different brands and generations will use different sockets, but several motherboard brands have started making their 12th Gen Intel motherboards for the new DDR5 form factor, which is both a lot more expensive and harder to find than DDR4, and so definitely not suitable for a budget build. Moving on to the next at number 2 with AMD Ryzen 5 5600s. The Ryzen 5 5600s has been one of the best budget CPUs since its release way back in 2020. A status that will continue until at least the launch of the Zen 4 7000 series, which is expected in the latter half of this year. The main appeal of the Ryzen 5 5600 is in its versatility. Like all AMD processors, it's unlocked and therefore capable of being overclocked. Intel processors, despite their typically higher base and boosted clock speeds, are often split on whether or not they can be overclocked. If you're not overclocking and don't have a lot of high-intensity processing needs, then you'll find that the lower power consumption and consequently lower temperature and cooling needs to be a significant boon. The Ryzen 5 5600 is a 6-core processor. Most day-to-day operations on a PC, including gaming, typically only use between 2 and 4 cores. So the 6 cores available from this processor are going to smoothly handle just about anything short of really heavy rendering or video editing. Like most processors in the most recent generations, it has multi-threaded cores. Having more than one thread per processor allows a larger number of commands to be stored and read, and allows the CPU to quickly perform complex tasks or have multiple programs running simultaneously. Despite being on the older side for a processor, the base clock speed of 3.7 GHz is on par with some of the 12th Gen Intel processors. The built-in boosting goes up to 4.6 GHz, which is slightly lower than you'll see from a lot of both 11th and 12th Gen Intel CPUs, but will deliver quick response times for most daily operations, including high-end gaming and streaming. The number 3 position is held by Intel Core i5 of 11600. When it comes to building a PC, it's important to know where you need to splurge and where you can scale back a little without sacrificing performance. While each new generation of processors does bring noticeable improvements, a lot of users aren't going to be pushing their processors to the point where those differences are going to make a consistent difference. So, getting a processor that's a generation or 2 back can be the perfect way to free up money for a better GPU or some awesome custom cooling, especially with prices and availability being what they are. If you are going to step back a generation, or if you already have an LGA 1200 board, one of your best choices is going to be the Intel Core i5 of 11600. This processor is the 11th generation version of one of 2022's best processors, the i5 of 12600. Intel did start using a hybrid architecture in the 12th generation, so there's a wider gap in performance between some of the 11th and 12th generation processors than you'll usually see between generations, but a lot of the base specs are still very similar. The i5 of 11600 is a 6-core processor, which is going to be ideal for most gamers, streams, and casual content creators. A lot of games are barely making full use of a 4-core processor, so 6 cores is the power to spare even once you throw streaming in the mix. All 6 cores are multi-threaded for increased efficiency, unlocking even more speed and multitasking efficiency. Next at number 4, we have Intel Core i5 of 12500. In theory, the Intel Core i5 of 12500 should be the budget-friendly version of the i5 of 12600. The Intel MSRP is almost $100 lower despite having a lot of the same baseline specs. As of launch, that hasn't been the case, though once we approach the middle of the year, that might start to resolve itself. Both the i5 of 12500 and the 12600 have 6 of what Intel has labeled performance cores or P-cores. In previous generations, these are just what would have been referred to as the standard multi-threaded cores. However, for its 12th generation of CPUs, Intel has added efficiency cores, or E-cores, which can boost the performance of your CPU with minimal increases in price and power consumption. However, unlike the i5 of 12600, the i5 of 12500 doesn't have any E-cores. With that being said, if the i5 of 12500 was consistently in stock, and you could get it at the list price suggested by Intel, that would be a justifiable deal. For now, that's not the case. Stocks are just low enough, in fact, to make it roughly the same price as the much higher performing 12600. Even if this resolves as we head into summer or fall 2022, there's another issue: the clock rate. It's really disappointing to see a base clock of only 3.0 GHz in a 12th gen processor, and the boost of 4.6 GHz only partially makes up for that. If you tend to do a lot of processor-heavy tasks, it's going to need to keep hitting that boosted rate, which will drive up power consumption and cooling demand. It's also not overclockable. The number 5 position is held by AMD Ryzen 5 5600. As the name would suggest, the AMD Ryzen 5 5600 is very similar to the AMD Ryzen 5 5600s. There are a few key differences that we'll go over, but the only difference that a casual user is going to notice is the price. The AMD Ryzen 5 5600 is one of the cheapest options on this list, usually way cheaper than the Ryzen 5 5600s. In spite of the price difference, it has benchmarks that are competitive with a lot of the more expensive CPUs you might find on this list. Like any good gaming CPU, the Ryzen 5 5600 is a 6-core, 12-thread processor. In fact, that's typically more power than you'll need, freeing up some space for streaming, and will even give you some serious power for advanced applications. Further, the base clock rate is a bit higher than you'll see from a lot of contemporary and even some newer processors at 3.9 GHz. The default boosts only go to 4.4 GHz, which is anywhere from 0.2 GHz to 0.5 GHz lower than what's offered by most other competitive processors. However, since this is an AMD Ryzen processor, it's unlocked and overclockable, and so the boosted clock rate can be whatever you say it is as long as you have the cooling to back it up. If you're a creative professional who isn't familiar or comfortable with overclocking, you'll probably want something with a higher default boost. For AFib 10600, we're going back 2 full generations from the current models, with Intel pushing out a new model basically every year, and the AFib 10600 being a later model in the 10th generation. You'll barely see any differences between this and an 11th Gen 11600. The 11th generation in turn has a lot of similarities to the 12th Gen models, so an older processor like this will let you play all of the current releases while being significantly cheaper. The 10th Gen is still in production, but since it's 2 generations back, and at least 2 years old at this point, you're going to start seeing them marked down below the already low MSRP. If you're lucky, you might be able to grab this one way below the $300 mark. Like its equivalents in later generations, the AFib 10600 is a 6-core processor, which will pull its weight in any current releases and will even perform moderately well in more processor-intensive activities. If you're a professional streamer or video editor, you might want to go with the newer gen or get something with a couple of extra cores. But otherwise, it's going to check all the boxes you need for regular use. Besides that, the cores are still multi-threaded, allowing them to prepare multiple command lines at once, making your processor much quicker on the execution when handling complex tasks or running more than one program at once. Furthermore, the AFib 10600 has a tight range when it comes to clock speeds, with a base of 4.1 GHz and a max of 4.8 GHz. The high clock speeds will make it really quick when it comes to launching and running individual programs, though the higher base tends to make it more power-hungry than some other processors that launched the same year, especially a lot of the Ryzen 5 processors. It can also make cooling more of an issue if you're not dealing with a well-ventilated case, and even more of an issue if you decide to overclock it, since this is an unlocked processor, allowing you to overclock for added performance. Moving on to the next at number 7 with Intel Core i7 10700. As a general rule, if you're looking to stay under $300 for your CPU, you're going to be confined to a 4 or 6 core processor. There are a couple of exceptions, the most worthwhile among them being the Intel Core i7 10700. The i7 models are on the higher end of Intel's Core series, and in the newest generations run upwards of $400. So getting one for less than $300 is a great deal. Granted, it's a couple of generations back, which takes some of the cutting edge shine off, but it still packs a lot of raw power. In a lot of cases, a multi-threaded 8-core processor like the i7 10700 is more than you're going to need for most day-to-day activities, including gaming. If you're not regularly doing a ton of processor-intensive activities like rendering, video editing, compiling large programs, and so on, then you're going to get smoother performance from a newer 6-core processor for the same price. If you're regularly performing processor-heavy tasks in a professional capacity, then you could probably justify scaling up to something like an AMD. A budget 8-core processor like this one is going to be best for students and others who may be consistently performing those tasks but are still at an entry level. Further, the i7 10700 has a lower base clock rate of 2.9 GHz but a max clock of 4.8 GHz. This is a wider range than you'll find in a lot of the 10th generation, but means that it's more efficient at the low end, but can quickly ramp up when dealing with demanding tasks. It's a particularly good configuration for people who have very light demands of their PC for most of the day, with brief segments of high-intensity work or gaming. The number 8 position is held by AMD Ryzen 5 3600. A casual observer could be forgiven for thinking that the AMD Ryzen 5 3600 is basically the same processor as the Ryzen 5 5600s. Most of the differences are down to the Zen 12 Zen 3 architecture, which have to do with core grouping and the way the individual cores access the processor. The Zen 3 is obviously more efficient in this respect, but a Zen 12 processor with otherwise identical main specs is going to give you a very similar level of performance, so can be a way to save some money if other parts of your build, like the GPU, are going to be doing more heavy lifting. Like the 5600s, the Ryzen 5 3600 is a hexa-core processor. If you're spending more than $200 on a processor, you're wasting your money on anything that doesn't have at least 6 cores. 6 cores is also a comfortable minimum for most mid-range gaming PCs, and will prevent your CPU from being the performance bottleneck no matter what games you're playing. All 6 cores are dual-threaded for higher multitasking efficiency and better performance for complex single programs. Ryzen's 5 series is highly power efficient, and the 65W consumption is almost half of what you'll see from most of their Intel competitors. Part of this is the lower base clock rate, which is 3.6 GHz in the 3600 model. This comes at the expense of a lower max clock rate ceiling, in this case 4.2 GHz. Next at number 9, we have Intel Core i5 of 11500. The aim of the i5 500 models has consistently been to use the increases in efficiency of the new generation of chips to drive the price down. The difference in MSRP between the 11,500 and 12,500 is only $10. Ironically, the reputation of these chips as an efficient budget option has caused them to be hit hard by the current chip shortage and driven the price in most outlets up by substantial margins. The i5 of 11,500 is currently going for about $250 in most outlets, which is lower than the i5 of 12,500 but doesn't quite live up to the promise of an efficient budget chip when many of the performance-focused CPUs on this list are going for a similar price. Without the rock-bottom price to distinguish it, there's not much that makes the i5 of 11,500 special. It's a slightly stripped-down version of the i5 of 11,600, which is to say it's a 6-core, 12-thread processor that's going to deliver an amount of power that's not exactly exciting, but adequate for gaming, streaming, and photo editing, and even some light video work. Now, there's a wider range between the base and max clock rate than what you get from a lot of the rest of the 11th generation. The base sits at a very low 2.7 GHz, but the boost is all the way up to 4.6 GHz. The low base clock rate can be good for energy efficiency and not driving up the internal temperature of your PC as much as some other Intel chips. But AMD still delivers better on that front and has better base clock rates. Finally, the number 10 position is dominated by Intel Core i5 9700. The i5 9700 is going to be basically the last resort for someone looking to spend the smallest amount of money possible on an 8-core processor. Getting anything with 8 cores for less than $300 is an accomplishment, so it deserves a spot on this list. But whether it's the right processor for you is going to be highly contextual. A CPU with a high core count like the i5 9700 is going to be good for demanding but straightforward tasks. It will be a good fit for users who do a lot of rendering or compiling. But since Intel did start using hyperthreading on all CPUs until the 10th generation, this is going to not be nearly as good for tasks that are both demanding and complex. There's only one thread per core, which means the CPU can't have as many commands ready at once and will be slower for multitasking or the parallel processes involved with streaming. For example, even if you are mostly performing tasks where the multiple threads aren't going to be as critical, you'll still notice the difference between an 8-core/8-thread processor like the i5 9700 and an 8-core/16-thread like the i5 10700. If you do go with this CPU and do a lot of work on straightforward, demanding tasks, like the ones mentioned, then the high boosted clock rate of 4.9 GHz and additional overclocking capacity is going to be a lot faster than any of the slower 6-core processors. That's all for today. We upload computer and accessories product review videos every single day, so don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for the upcoming video notification.